Sure, everybody. We'll just open with the karakia. I'm pretty sure you've seen some of the materials already for this session, and it's going to be very exciting. I'll start with the karakia, and then we will immediately go to our discussion for this afternoon. Tutawa mai irunga, tutawa mai iraro, tutawa mai iwaho, tutawa mai iroto. Kia tawai, te Maori tu, te Maori ora, ki te katoa, humie, huye, taikie.
Yeah.
Morena, good afternoon. I hand you over to Suzanne to introduce our speaker.
Kia ora, everyone. Morena, morning to where you are, and good afternoon to Gay and Haiping. So we are now in session 5, and we're going to look at some of the sort of regional challenges, but also, as you can see on Haiping's slide, also opportunities. As we were just saying, we live in quite unsettled times at the moment. So yes, there are a lot of challenges, but I think it's also really important that we think about what some of the opportunities are as well. So Haiping is from the Department of Economics at our business school here at Waipapa Taumataro. And he is also, you are the chair of the APEC Study Centre, I believe, Haiping. So I will thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak with us today. I'm sure the scholars are eagerly anticipating what you have to say, given their regional position. So I will hand over to you. Thank you, Haiping.
Hi, Susanna. Thank you so much for inviting me to be teaching this session. So I would encourage all the scholars to be actively interacting with me during my presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to either post questions through the chat box. I think either Susanna or Guy, could you like to keep watching the chat box so that we can interact with our scholars? Because today's I would like to give you an overview about the recent economic prospects in the Chinese economy, as well as various challenges the Chinese economy is facing, as well as some of the most recent developments, which seems quite interesting for the next few years. So the first slide I would like to share with you is the mixed message about Chinese economy in the last 2 years, since 2022 actually. But I took some of this news headline from the major mainstream media in the including Bloomberg, Reuters, Economist. So on this box, you can see selected news headlines, which doesn't seem very encouraging. So, for example, Bloomberg actually reported last year the Chinese economy failed to pick up after the war stretch in the fifth quarters. And also, South China Morning Post also talk about the trade barriers, not only from advanced economy, but also from potentially emerging economies against Chinese exports. And also, property market is always a big headache for China in the last few years. And the sales slumps and investment goes down at a very large margin. And the economists also talk about Chinese economy suffering from a crisis of confidence. So China's fiscal revenue has to go down because economic growth is going down. And obviously, the fiscal revenue also go down. And this is all the bad news, to be honest. And it looks quite depressing. However, if you look at these box, in the meantime, you see a lot of interesting news representing quite encouraging results. For example, World Bank raised China's GDP forecast for this year and for next year. It means 2024, 2025. So that's 2 years. And also, even though there's kind of potential trade disputes with the US, with European Union, China's foreign trade hit record high last year, 2024. And analysts expect China's property market to recover this year, despite this kind of very dramatic slowdown in the last 3 years. And Morgan Stanley, UBS joined the bullish chorus on China's AI-led rally early this month. So if you follow the Deutsche Bank, they recently published a very interesting report talking about the title is quite interesting. Is the China East World. They're basically talking about how China's AI models would change the landscape of artificial intelligence and how that could potentially affect the long-term economic growth in China. And the last one, is about the China economic stimulus package would help partially offset U.S. tariff hike in 2025. So last time that so until recently, China's monetary and fiscal policy has always been quite tightened. So the last time we saw such kind of policy announcement about in the stimulus package, that was shortly after global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. In the last 10 years or more than 10 years, China has always implemented very prudent monetary policy and conservative fiscal policy. And last October, the government, for the first time over the decades, they decide to switch gear to the relative ease monetary policy and stimulate fiscal policy. And this is a very interesting movement. Some people argue this probably because anticipating the Trumps get reelected, the Chinese government tried to adopt this relatively positive attitude towards macroeconomic policies. So these, if you look at public media or mainstream media, you see very different headlines. So in today's session, I would like to give you some facts. However, this is not the purpose. The purpose is to give you kind of underlying logic behind these current observations, as well in how to synthesize different facts we observed. All right. So I will probably talk about three aspects in the lecture. The first one is about the big thing is the property market. This is not a small or moderate slowdown of property sector in China. It's a very big dramatic change in the last 3 years. And then I'll talk about overcapacity and also the China shock 2.0, and also talk about MIC, so Made in China 2025. This keywords has been in silence for almost 8 years. The Made in China 2025 was a plan announced in China in 2015, 10 years ago, by the Chinese government. However, shortly after its announcement, it was kept silent. The Chinese government doesn't talk about that much. However, this year is 2025, and recently, I mean, last 2 months actually, the mainstream media start to talking about these things very loud and louder. And this is something I would like to also share with you about, because this one gives you, if you're connecting the property market slump together with the recent heated debate about Made in China 2025, you will see clearly the logic be connecting these two things. And in the end, I'll talk about the international dimension of Chinese economy. Basically, how will China respond to geoeconomic tensions, especially U.S.-China trade war or economic war, more specifically the tech war, right? Let's start with the property market. So this chart shows you the growth rate of new residential property price indices in China in the last decade, in 2010 to 2019. So if you look at this chart, it shows three curves. Each curve represents a group of cities. So the first tier city usually refers to the top four. Peking, Shanghai, and Shenzhen and Guangzhou, these are the four metropolitan areas, the most developed, most advanced, with most advanced economy in China. And of course, their property price increases very dramatically high during each boom. And there are second layers or second tier cities. So usually refer to the capital city of each provinces, as well as some of the advanced areas. And other cities usually refer to small, medium-sized cities. So you will see the price in the property price indices are moving in the three group of cities, moving relatively in the same direction. And if you look at the vertical axis, it's annual growth rate of these prices. It usually goes to 10%, even close to 20%. And in the peak of the 2016, it even goes close to 30%. That's annual growth rate. That's crazy, right? So obviously, this is not very normal, very healthy the property market. And if you look at this shaded area, it refers to the area where the government regulation policy is in place. So even with government regulation on the property market, the price growth rate still remain very high until they slow down. So usually there is a time lag between the policy implementation to the effects the policy take, right? So this chart shows you, especially this part, shows you the yield, rental yield. So rental yield is calculated at the monthly rent or annual rent divided by the price of the property. So if you look at this is the 4 tier 1 cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. So in 2010, for example, in these 4 tier cities, usually if you buy a house like $1 million, right? So on average, you will get roughly $1 million. You will get roughly $30,000 as monthly rent income. That gives you a rental return of 3%. And if you look at 8 years later, for the same 1 million house, you will only get $10,000 as rental income. Or equivalently speaking, if the rental income does not change much, it means what? It means that the price of the property has increased to $3 million. So this is really kind of stunning facts, showing that how does house price in these major cities become more and more unlivable, unsustainable, right? So what's behind that? There are so many factors behind that, either because of Chinese economic growth so fast or because of urbanization process, where more and more people move to the major cities, so they would like to buy more and more houses. There's a whole line of literature talking about the housing price boom in China in the last two decades. So taking these facts as it is, what does that mean? How does that affect the rental? How does that affect the property market investment? So this chart shows you the property investment fundraised by developers as well as property sales by floor areas. So in the last 10 years, in the last decade, you will see clearly the very fast the housing price boom and attract so much property investment and also so much fund flow into the property markets. And if this inflow of funds flow into the property markets purely take the form of the equity of the developer, that's all fine. But what is actually happening is these development funds flow into the real estate sectors. They are mostly borrowed, not by the self-controlled fund, self-collected funds by the developers. So essentially, if you look at the top 5 developers, debt to asset ratio in 2019 at the peak of this period, it is 81 to 87%. So what does that means? It means that if a developer build a house of $1 million, suppose, how much does this the funds that used to build this $1 million houses coming from their own pocket? Only 13 to 19% coming from their own pocket. The rest of the funds either coming from the buyers or coming from the banks or coming from other external sources. So this basically reflects very high leverage ratio of these sectors. And during that period, if you look at the US, the global interest rate is relatively low. We have a decade of low world interest rate. So that low interest rate facilitate this kind of high leverage of real estate developers in China. And obviously, this we know that when the US retract from QE, and they try to hike the interest rate, right? So if they hike the interest rate, the cost of paying existing debt will become higher and higher. Or in other words, if you want to roll over existing debt, you need to pay high interest rate. So that would potentially pose a risk for these developers. So if you look at the non-performing loan ratio of these Chinese property developers, you will see that until recently, you see that this non-performing loan ratio relatively low. And however, if you look at non-performing loan rate for the property developer loans, it start to rise from 5% from less than 0.5% to 1%, and most recently going up. right? So this is the facts. But what's driving behind these facts? So if you look at Chinese public media, you will see in 2016, December 2016, government start to announce or have some kind of moral persuasion on the public media, talking about property is to be lived in, not to be speculated on. So this is a very kind of moral persuasion without too much regulation yet. Or in other words, regulation is implemented not so fiercely, not so strongly. However, if you look back to the house price boom in 2016, it is continue rise until it goes down in 2018. And this is cool down the market a little bit. However, in 2019, the house price boom again start to rise. So it means that moral persuasion, in other words, the traditional regulation implemented by Chinese government on the housing market doesn't work so effectively or only lasts for a very relatively short time period. And the house price boom recover very quickly. So if the moral persuasion doesn't work, what should government do? If you're familiar with Chinese economy, you will see the government has all kinds of instruments in their toolbox to regulate the market. So this time they have a very different, they use very different policy toolbox called the three red lines. So three red line, basically they impose three hard criteria to decide whether developers can borrow or roll over their existing debts. The first criteria called solvency criteria. It basically says that the total liability of these developers, including short-term, long-term, all kinds of liability, cannot exceed 70% of their assets. And the other criteria is also solvency criteria. Basically, net debt should not exceed their equity. And the third one is about liquidity. So the developer's cash reserve must be more than enough to cover their short-term debt. Short-term debt usually refer to 3 months to 1 year debt. So these three hard criteria implemented actually reduces the borrowing capacity of developers, even though they have a lot of the land holding in their hands. Even they have a very ambitious plan, even though their project is doing very well, if their accounting the data does not satisfy these three criteria, they cannot borrow a cent from the bank. This is a very, very hard regulation policy that ever implemented for the real estate market. Remember, this is the time where China just jumped off of the COVID. Because China has implemented very effective zero COVID policy at the very beginning in 2020, and in May 2020, the China actually lifted all the COVID policy, and everyone rushed to the housing market to buy houses, and this is the policy is implemented to try to slow down this housing market boom, and banks are also required to reduce their issuance to new mortgage loans in August 2020. So this policy is targeted at real estate developers, try to reduce their borrowing capacity. And this policy actually targeted towards banks and more ultimately targeted towards the buyers, house buyers. So these two policies was implemented in such a large scale that it triggers a liquidity crisis in 2020 to 2023. So we'll see these are the Chinese developers bond price in the for state-owned developers as well as privately owned developers. So we'll see clearly many of the largest developers. There, for example, the Country Garden, which is very famous or one of the largest developers. Their bond price falling by 81%. 1 year later. And this is not only the Country Garden, but also the top 100 developers, the sales goes down by 29% from 1 year ago. That's very, very harsh policy. And in October 2023, the Country Garden failed to pay their US bond and triggered cross default in 11 billion offshore bonds. So this is a very, effective, but has very large consequence. And in 2024, 1 year ago, the Evergrande, which is the largest developer in China, was ordered to liquidate. So this is a very dramatic consequence for these policies. And in retrospect, it looks like the Chinese government implement too harsh the policy, almost kill its real estate market. And uh, of course, if you are familiar with the housing market, the importance of housing market, you probably know that 70% of this private ownership of the houses is accounting for 7% of household wealth in China. In other words, the majority of the household wealth is allocated in their houses, in their homes, right? So if the house price goes down, of course, the wealth effect will erode consumers' confidence. So if you look at consumer confidence index in China, has been pretty okay even during COVID, because China quickly get out of COVID for the entire 2020. However, when this kind of COVID, when Shanghai actually had a COVID-19 outbreak in the early 2022, 2 years after the original COVID, so Shanghai is closed down for quite a while, and actually drive the consumer confidence index substantially to a very low level. And even when the China lifted zero COVID policy, it doesn't change the picture very much. The consumer confidence still remain at the lower than 100. 100 basically is the benchmark for neutral. Above 100 means the consumer are exuberant about their future income, therefore they are willing to spend. If the index is below 100, it means consumers are very relatively pessimistic about the future. Therefore, they would like to buy less or consume less. So you can see clearly, even after COVID policy was lifted at the end of 2022, this index still remain at below 90. So very different from before that. So one of the argument, because the wealth effect due to the house market collapsing actually is triggering, is actually affecting the consumer price index. So these are the three-tier house price indexes. If the blue line, the green line is the consumer confidence index. You can see clearly consumer confidence index is driven ultimately by this housing price index. So that's why people say housing market policy was one of the policy that dragged economy in China drag down the Chinese economy in the last 4 years. And if you look at if consumers have become less confident about the future or relatively pessimistic about the future, it's due to the negative wealth effect. Therefore, there will be less demand, and that will cause the production to be also going down. So if this is another important economic indicator called manufacturing purchasing manager index, so the survey index covering the purchasing managers' sentiments about the economic performance in the near future, therefore affect their willingness to expand or contraction. So if this index number is above 50, it means that purchasing manager, they are optimistic about the future, therefore they would like to buy more materials, components. So this represents their willingness to expand their business. If this indicator is below 50, that means that the purchasing manager are looking very pessimistic about the future, therefore they would contract their production. So if you look at this for the Chinese data, you will see that most of the time in the last 3 years, since middle of 2021, this index is below this benchmark. So no wonder that Chinese economy slow down. People argue that is one of the causes is property market slow down. And this is one thing. This is about the implication to the production. How about jobs? If you look at this is the year-to-year growth rate of job posting on the online hiring platform. So 51 Job and Liapin, they are two major online job portal. So if you look at the year-to-year annual growth rates for job posted on these two major job platform, you will see clearly things change a lot in 2022. So the job posted on this platform has been going down by 30% for the young job seekers. For the overall job announcement on this platform also go down more than 20%. And even now it hasn't recovered to the we still witness the decline of this job posted on this online platform. So this doesn't look very good for the Chinese economy. And so this is one side of the story explaining why this yes,
Before you move on,
yeah,
there was a question in the chat.
yeah.
Can China continue bailing out its real estate firms like banker? Could it create a moral hazard? And what are the potential impacts on its bond market and overall economic stability?
I think this is a very good question because people usually talk about the moral hazard for the banking sector, right? So I don't think the government would bail out the real estate developers, but they were more likely to bail out the banks, especially the state-owned banks, or are usually the systematically big banks. However, this time is different. If you look at the resolution process for the developers, the Chinese government doesn't bail out them. They let the market decide, and they don't even intervene too much in the litigation process by the developers. Essentially, the developers have to either sell their existing land holding under their portfolio to the other developers to get cash so that they can pay out their short-term debt, or they, as we said, the Evergrande enter into the bankruptcy process. So this is a very interesting. However, having said that, so when the real estate developers they do go bankrupt, who are suffering? Not developers, the banks, because they are lending too much money to these developers at the peak of the housing market boom, right? So these banks probably were subject to much more trouble. And this is the things happen. This is a there's a I think there's a lot of report talking about 1 year ago, talking about how to ensure the timely delivery of the houses by the developers. So some of the major developers, they committed to deliver the house to the buyers um, over the next 2 years, 2024, 2025, under the condition that their property will be valued at the fair market prices. However, we still haven't observed the latest data on that. So in some sense that real estate developers sectors is still one of the major concern for the government, not only because their financial or liability posed on the banks, but also eventually on the home buyers. Because in China, if you buy a house, you are not buying house on the spot. You actually prepay the house full amount of the house price, and you wait for 2 years or 3 years to get the house when it is fully built. So in other words, you need to pay the full amount before the house is ever built. So when the developer default on their liability, essentially they are defaulting on the commitment of delivering the house on time. So there is a lot of social unrest in many of the cities in China concerning this the housing developer, they cannot deliver the house on time. So this is one of the major concerns for the local governments, not only the banking liability, but also the home buyers, right? So this is the more concerning issues. Anyway, I guess this problem will continue to exist in the next few years, before this problem is fully solved. All right. So let's move on to the next topic. In the first part of the lecture talking about relatively pessimistic views on Chinese economy. And the second part is something relatively new and also very interesting. Actually, it's happening mostly in the last 2 or 3 years. So last year, in April 2024, the former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited China, talking about China's overcapacity in many of the products categories, and also many other issues, including TikTok. However, if you look at the fundamental data that motivate Janet Yellen's overcapacity doctrine, is about China's export, China's trade with the rest of the world. If you look at the U.S., China's trade balance with the United States, so before the Trump trade war in 2017, U.S. run trade deficit against China is a huge amount. After 6 years, before Janet Yellen coming to China in 2023, U.S. trade deficit against China is not shrinking but expanding despite the tariffs that Trump holds on China. So this is basically China running even more trade surplus against U.S. and also against not only U.S. but most of the country. And the trade surplus is actually expanding rather than declining. So this is the argument that Janet Yellen wants to post to the Chinese counterpart about how to address this issue. And if you look at the look at the composition of Chinese export to the rest of the world, you will see a very interesting developments. So this is a small but in rising components, including the motor vehicles, including electric vehicles, rechargeable batteries, and solar panels, and all these green energy products. This is called the new trial or new three in Chinese media. And it in contrast to the old three. What are the old three? The clothes, furniture, and home appliances, which was very popular in Chinese export since China joined WTO. So these are labor intensive, relatively low value added, and China can produce at a huge scale and export to the rest of the world. And however, this is a new trial was really new because, for example, the motor vehicles, China export of motor vehicle was very little until 2020. Suddenly, in 2021, start to pick up, increase. I don't know how many folded, but increase from maybe 10 billion to roughly 70 billion within 3 years. That's really fast. If you look at other components, also increasing crazily. So this basically is a trend that concerning European Union mostly. So that's why in 2024, middle of 2024, European Union start to looking at the Chinese EV imports and start this anti-subsidy investigation. So this basically is what China's new trial. If comparing new trial versus the new three versus old three, you will see that new three are usually, first of all, relatively high tech. Second, relatively high value added. And third, are relatively in the sector where the US and all European Union all firms also are aiming towards. So there is what we call the frontier products or high value added products, where the European Union firms would also like to produce. So in other words, if you look at Chinese O3, which are the products which are not produced by the US or European counterparts. Therefore, there's no conflict of interest between Chinese exports to the European Union or to the US versus existing producers in the US. However, the new trail or the new three are exactly the product where the European Union or US firms would like to produce. So this time, the new three becomes will refer to the sectors where US and China will have a direct competition. So this is interesting changes, but this is only part of the story. So if you look at the grand picture, you will see that behind this relatively sudden increase of new three in China, there has been a long plan. Basically, there has been a relatively plan implemented by the government in the last more than 10 years. So one of the important policy that announced by Chinese government in May 2015 is called Made in China 2025. So if you're familiar with China's policy making process, it's very clear to you that Chinese government is always making long-term plans. So every 5 years, they have a 5-year plan. And above the 5-year plan, they have a 10-year plan. Above 10-year plan, they have a long-term, usually 15 or 20 years, a long-term general principle of economic development. So there are different layers. There's long-term plan, medium-term plan, and short-term plan. Short-term plan usually referred to every 5 years because Chinese government usually have a term of 5 years. So this is relatively what we call medium-term plans implemented in May 2015. However, this plan was already in discussion shortly after global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. At that time, China has been suffering substantially from the declining demand from US market because US was hit heavily by the global financial crisis. And if you look at the Chinese export to the US in 2009, 2010, it's a disaster. So U.S. was previously China major exporting destinations. If you look at the 1990s, U.S. account 1/3 of Chinese export of the rest of the world to the rest of the world, and this is a very, very big amount. And obviously, even when China joined WTO, the role of U.S. in China's exports is also even more important. However, the global financial crisis hit U.S. heavily, not China heavily, and therefore the demand from U.S. market declined a lot. Therefore, it leads to a substantial bankruptcy of Chinese firms in the coastal area, which are traditionally exporting to the U.S. market. And then, since then, the Chinese government actually talking about upgrading their industrial structure, try to not focusing on the old three, but moving up along the value chain. And this policy was designed shortly after global financial crisis and eventually announced in May 2015. And the purpose is to boost China's competitiveness in global manufacturing value chain and also leapfrogging into emerging technology which are not yet defined global leaders and standards. So there's a very interesting term called these days in Chinese researchers, Chinese media. It's called overtaking via changing lanes. So what does that mean? It means that previously China was serving as a follower of frontier technology, while the Made in China 2025 envisions that Chinese firms should create their own lanes, create their own subsectors in the industry that they can take leadership, rather than following the existing pioneering in the West by the Western firms. So also they promote indigenous innovation. Through the acquisition, absorption, or adaptation of foreign technology, the purpose is to reduce reliance on foreign firms. So this is the grand vision of Chinese policy for Made in 2025. Obviously, this is very different from traditional Chinese economic policy of following the frontier. And after this policy was announced, in shortly as 2 or 3 years, the public media stopped talking about this. One of the arguments behind this change is because Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and then it started to press on Chinese government, saying that this Made in 2025, Made in China 2025 would become a challenge for U.S. leading in economic or technology. So therefore, especially after 2018, U.S.-China trade war started, Chinese government stopped talking about this. However, they are still doing the things, not publicly, but through other forms of economic policies. And of course, to achieve this, it requires a lot of subsidy and a lot of support, monetary or non-monetary support for local firms. And this is the one thing. And later on, especially during after the U.S.-China trade war started, or in 2018, China announced another plan, a grand vision about China Standard 2035, and is try to set global standards for emerging technology. And these are the things we observe nowadays very common. But at that time, it doesn't look very promising for China to do so. But after maybe 6 years, it becomes obvious that China is indeed working very hard on this dimension. And 2023, China come up with a new kind of slogan talking about advancing new quality productive forces, which is a very new term coined by the Chinese media. Well, it's very hard to understand what exactly it refers to. However, if you look at many of the documents, it refers to advanced technology, which has a high efficiency and high quality, and mostly they are talking about industrial upgrading. So if you look at 3 plans, they are building upon one after another. So, and clearly this is, if you look at the former Senator Mark Rubio, the current US Secretary of State, he published a report last September reviewing the Made in China 2025. According to his report, he find that as of last year, because last year was the 9th year of this plan, China has achieved a goal for 4 of the 10 sectors it targeted. So the Made in China 2025 listed the 10 strategic important sectors for each sectors, Chinese government give exactly number of some quantitative indicator for as a goal for these sectors. And according to Mark Rubio's report, for electric vehicle, energy, power generation, high-speed rail, and shipbuilding, these 4 sectors, China has already achieved its goal or surpassed its previous set goals. And China has partially accomplished its goals in the 5 sectors, including aerospace, aviation, biotechnology, new material, robotics, and machine tools, and semiconductors. So China has only failed to achieve its one sector, which is agricultural machinery last year. But this year is 2025. So I think there will be people reviewing China's grand plan at the end of this year to check whether the goal are achieved. And if you look at this Mark Rubio's report, it gives a very clear evidence showing that the plan announced almost 10 years ago has really achieved its goals given the short time frame. And let me show you one particular sector, which is energy and power generation sector, and focusing particularly on the new energy, renewable energy capacity. So this chart shows you the renewable electricity capacity growth rate over the 4 particular period. So every 5 years, you can see how this renewable electricity capacity changes in China, in European Union, United States, and the rest of the world. So if you look at renewable energy capacity, growth rate was relatively small for China in 2005 to 2010. At that time, China still relied heavily on this fossil energy like coal. And later on in 2011, it started to increase its investment and also the capacity growth rate. And the major changes actually come from 2017 to 2022. So it increased substantially. So this is not only in accordance of Chinese commitment to the Paris Accord, and but more importantly, China has a much more views on the importance of renewable electricity capacity. So it has already announced the capacity growth plan for 2023 to 2028. So if you look at the bars, comparing the bars for China and the rest of the world, you can see clearly in 2017 to 2020, China's renewable electricity capacity growth rate is roughly half of the world growth rate. And for the next 5 years, it will be account for even larger share for the world growth rate. And obviously, that comes with a very important consequence for the CO2 emission. So if you look at CO2 emission in China has been increasing even shortly before the Paris Accord, it has been increasing because China committed to reaching a carbon peak in 2030. And it interestingly observed that in 2024, it seems that China's carbon emission already reaches the peak, doesn't increase, or at least remain plateau in 2024. So this is something that partially because Chinese economic slowdown, or because of the very fast growth rate of renewable electricity capacity growth rate in China. So these are interesting facts about renewable electricity growth. So if you look at the wind and solar energy production explicitly, you can see clearly that for G7 countries, the advanced economy groups, they own half of the world wealth, basically global GDP, and they're building only 10% of wind and solar projects, while China actually built roughly 70% of the wind and solar projects. So China is very enthusiastic about renewable energy. And if you look at by country level, this is the 2024 data. China is building 339 gigawatts, roughly 64% of the rest of the world. And if you look at in 2024 data, China is home to nearly half of the global solar and wind power. And if you look at the plan for the future, it's even more dramatic. So by looking at these facts, what do we learn from this? So if you look at this is the solar what we call solar farm in the west region of China, which is usually not the most developed regions. So this is a picture showing you the operating solar farm in China. So we all know that China has the most developed region in the east coast. However, the west and inland area usually are relatively underdeveloped. With this new technology, solar panel technology, China actually is able to build this dramatic solar farm in the rural areas, and making rural areas a major source of energy. So why this is so important? So if you're familiar with energy sectors in China, China traditionally rely heavily on the coal and also imports of import of crude oil. So by installing this solar panel, China tried to reach its energy self-sufficiency. This is one of course, it's still far behind this, far below this self-efficiency standards, but it's getting closer to the energy self-sufficiency, one of the important strategic considerations. Now, of course, at very beginning, when you look at the solar panel in terms of the development of solar panel industry, it's very costly at the very beginning, because solar panel technology is not developed in China at the very beginning. It's developed in the European Union and also in the United States. The technology is not originally coming from China, and but China actually tried to adopt this technology, and the sunk cost or initial fixed cost for this technology is very heavy at the very beginning, and through all kinds of policy support, it allows this the first wave of solar panel boom in China feasible and possible. And later on, after roughly 1 decade of technology adoption and adaptation in China, so China became one of the largest, actually the largest solar panel exporter in the world. However, if you look at the data, China does not export a large chunk of solar panel to the rest of the world. In fact, they are using the solar panel mostly for domestic purposes, for building solar farm, to ensure self-sufficiency of the energy supply. If you are familiar with China's territory, it's a huge country, right? If you have a solar farm installed here, the energy will be generated in these places. But the major region that demand for electricity is not here. It's coastal area, right? If you want to transmit energy or electricity from the rural area far west to the east coast, it is not easy, because we know when you transmit electricity from one place to another places, there will be usually a loss of electricity during the transmission process. And that's why, for that purposes, China designed the ultra high voltage electricity transmission technology. It allows to transmit electricity through to 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers away, with very little reduction of electricity, or whether very little energy losses through this transmission process. So by doing so, you can see clearly, traditionally rural area now become the source of energy for China. And usually these places are rural area, usually are deserts or sands. But now by planting all this solar panel, it generates electricity and can be sold to the national grid. So interestingly, I think last year it is reported that the solar panel producing electricity has reached to the cost of electricity generated by solar panel is now as low as in the electricity generated by coal. So in other words, solar panel electricity could compete on the free market, and therefore this year, I think last week, the government announces that from middle of this year onwards, the new installation of solar panel will not receiving subsidy from the government anymore, because it's solar panel technology so advanced that the cost of solar panel so low that it can be compete directly on the free market. So no more support from the government will be offered to this to the solar panel farms. So this is very interesting or dramatic change in terms of the landscape of energy supply in China. And if you look at the wind farm, the similar stories. So this is the most developed region in the in China, and these are the very rural, underdeveloped region in China. However, these places usually have very rich resources of wind. Traditionally, people without this wind energy, wind electricity technology, people just let the wind come through. But now with this wind electricity technology, they can actually make use of this wind and convert it into electricity and supply to the East Coast. So why I talk about this? Because this one is highly related to China's digital infrastructure. So when you're looking at the public media these days, you probably heard about the AI, the future, right? So AI, big tech technology, all these kind of large language model require huge amount of electricity to boost them. For many of the economy, including European Union, including United States, they need to have build their own power station to power their large language model centers. So for China, I think this is very crucial or very important condition for China to develop its own digital infrastructure. So among this input that fuel China's AI system, U.S. export restriction actually affect the hardware the most. And then government actually expand their national computing power network to optimize resources efficiency. You basically say that everyone share the existing hardware, so that you don't have to buy your own GPUs or hardware to boost your own large language model. You're actually leveraging upon the national computing facilities, and including National Integrated Computing Power Network and China Computing Nets. These are all this kind of national level computational facility that facilitated by the government. And as of 2024, March 2024, over 30 cities are already actively building intelligent computing data centers specifically designed to running AI workloads. However, if you have so much data centers, you need to have a lot of resources, a lot of electricity, right? So if you look at China's most well-developed regions, usually in the East Coast, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou and Shenzhen. These are the Bay Area. This is the Yangtze River Delta. This is the Beijing-Tianjin data center. So with this, most of data generated in the East Coast. However, it's very costly to do the computation in this region because computation requires a lot of electricity, a lot of land to put in the servers. And what did Chinese government do? They actually create a computational center in the West Coast, in the West region, in the rural area, in the inland area, where this one matched exactly to the solar farm and wind farm. So therefore, they can generate electricity locally and did computation locally and send the results to the East Coast. This is what they called East data and West computing. So this is the way that China actually coordinate to try to offset partially the export restrictions by the US government. So what I can share with you is the Chinese government tried to implement a very interesting strategy. They provide infrastructure at the national level and then let the individual firms to compete at the low downstream of this sector. So upstream referred to the infrastructure that required for the AI industry. Well, the downstream basically means that all the app developers, large language model developers, they design the software, but they have to use the hardware to do the computation, right? So the computation part or infrastructure part is done by government, coordinated by the government to achieve national level efficiency. And the developers can log into this network and to test their software. So this is a very interesting. While most of the developers are private companies, not state-owned companies, and in fact, we have already it is very well known that the most intelligent or most innovative firms, they are all private firms. State-owned price usually are not. These firms are most innovative, but they are good at building infrastructure, right? So so there are kind of that gives us a very interesting discussion about industry policy. So I think in the last 4 years, industrial policy regained a lot of public media attention from public media. So nowadays, European Union, United States also start their own industrial policies. According to the economic literature, it's very clear there is no dispute. Industrial policy is usually not successful, most of the case. Even in the Chinese case, if you look at these articles published on first-tier economic journals, they already show that even in the Chinese case, industrial policy usually is not successful. And economic efficiency is even getting worse with industrial policy because it's very hard for the government to identify the winners. Even it is winners today, but it doesn't mean that it will be the winner tomorrow because the most innovative firms for tomorrow maybe hasn't been born yet. So by subsidizing current winners will only kill the innovation for tomorrow. So there's a whole line of literature talking about this. And but what the government should do or could do in the case I talked about just now is that government mostly focusing on infrastructure, or both hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure. Hard infrastructure refer to what I just mentioned: electricity network, electricity transmission, solar farm or wind farm. These provide the platform for the innovation to take place, while innovation is still done by the private sector. To subsidize this firm may not necessarily be the best solution. And in fact, many of the solar firms actually subsidized heavily by the Chinese government actually failed. So this is already well-documented economic facts. So how could industrial policy be effective? Besides what I said, the government can only do what the government can do, like building infrastructure. But the markets or private sectors should do the innovation part. So this is an interesting lesson we learned from Made in China 2025 initiative. And of course, by looking deeper into each sectors in Made in 2025, you can see clearly not all sectors are equally successful through the government support, right? So yeah, so that's what I want you to click this link. This is the IMF blog published last year. So industrial policy is back, but the bar is to get it right very, very high. So we could see very many countries, even though they implement industrial policy, but most of the case through Chinese evidence is already clear that it's very hard to get the right. And having said that, I think the next maybe 10 minutes or 5 minutes, I will give you a quick overview about what's going on in China's response to trade war with the United States.
I think, sorry, before you do that, there was another question in the chat about Taiwan's position in China's industrial and trade policies.
Which position?
Taiwan's position.
Oh, Taiwan. Could you be more explicit in which dimension? Is it in terms of technology, in terms of trade?
Lucia?
Okay, so I want to ask about the general perspective of Chinese government perspective on Taiwan, like where and what is Taiwan position in the whole China's industrial policies? Is it like important part in China's industrial policies? I know about the semiconductor, but other than that, how about that?
Yeah, I think there's for Taiwan is not Taiwan is leading in many niche market, including semiconductor chips and also other even software industry. They're doing quite well in some niche market. But if you look at the Chinese technology strategy, it is mostly inward looking. They try to be technology self-sufficiency. So these things become very clear after U.S.-China trade war started, and it's very clear and one way road for Chinese government, because they know from the beginning of the U.S.-China trade war or tech war, the China has to be self-sufficient. So this is what I see from the mass media. Taiwan, whether it is leading in semiconductor, is not controlled by China anymore. It couldn't be controlled by China anymore. So this is what I think that's a very good question. If you look at the recent trade, U.S. trade diversification, it is very clear that the Trump trade war is quite effective in diverting the trade dependence on China So this is the U.S. top trade partner as percent of U.S. total imports in 2024 to 2017, before trade war and last year. So if you look at 2017 data, China accounts for more than 20% of U.S. imports. However, 7 years later, China's only account for 14% or slightly less than 14% for U.S. total imports, but still a large amount, right? And however, the European Union and Mexico become larger, become the two largest trade partners in the U.S. imports. So U.S. import more from European Union, Mexico than from China now. So it means that Trump trade war is quite effective to reduce their dependence on China. So China's share in the U.S. imports has declined by roughly 7%. It's a big amount. And most of the other countries, their share in the U.S. imports either remain unchanged or even increase, like South Korea, like Vietnam, like Taiwan. So they are increasing their role in the U.S. imports. And how about China? So U.S. decoupled from China, right? How about China? China also decoupled from the U.S. So if you look at U.S. share in China's exports, so China fell by 4 percentage points for among China's exports, and also U.S. share in China's imports fell by 2 percentage points. So China buy less from the U.S. and sell less to the U.S. So who actually gain from that? Is ASEAN. ASEAN become now the largest trade partner of China, and it gains in China's imports and exports by 4% and 2.5 percentage points. It's a substantial increase, even larger than European Union. So this is a very dramatic change. That's what I call China is going south. South means that China going to the global south, to the developing country, and it actually decouple not only from the US, but also from European Union. But be careful, this is only in percentage term. But if you look at the in dollar term, China export and import from European Union versus the US is still increasing, but China start to increase its export and imports more from global south. I mean, last year I just checked China's 2024 data. Last year, China's trade with Asia economies account for more than 50% of its total trade with the rest of the world. So Asia becomes the center of China's trade partners. So if you look deeper, you see that China now export more with BRI countries, so Belt Road Initiative countries, usually are emerging economies or developing countries with a few advanced economies. So if you look at March 2023, China sell more than 50% of goods to BRI countries. And to similar patterns to emerging economies, China more going south because of they face headwinds in the United States and European Union. So this is a very clear trend and will continue to go in the next few years. And one interesting development I would like to share with you is about Chancay Port in Peru, recently announced during the APEC meetings last year. So this port was officially unveiled last November. So it is 80 kilometers north of Lima, the capital city of Peru, where the APEC meeting was hosted last year. And it's a major hub for China-South America trade. So if you look at this port closely, it is one of the largest port in South America and 2 meters deeper than the nearby port in Lima. 2 meters deeper means a lot because it is able to handle the world's biggest container ships. Traditionally, when you look at Peru or South America countries, when they try to export goods to China, they have to go either to Mexico or to the Long Beach, California, to move to the larger container ships before it can be shipped to China. But now it can go directly by loading the cargo, loading the container on the largest container ships and ship directly to China. And what's the benefit of going nonstop rather than stopover in Mexico and US previously? It will reduce shipping time by 10 or 15 or even 20 days, depending on the destination. That's a big amount, right? 10 days, 15 days, 20 days is a lot, especially for the agricultural produces like fruits. Usually fruits is a high value added. South America fruits is highly valued in China as well as in Asian markets. So cherry basically is one of the major exports from Peru to China during the Chinese New Year time, because the seasonality in the South Hemisphere is different from North Hemisphere, right? So this port was served Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador, among other South American countries. Now they can go directly to China with a shorter shipping time. That will create value for these economies. And this port will compete with Mexico and Long Beach port in the US and Mexico. But this will bring value to these emerging economies in the South America. So this is one example of BRI projects. So another example I would like to share with you is that not only through this infrastructure in the traditional way, but more through the digital way. This chart I borrowed from Merrick's interesting report 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, roughly, and they show what kind of those kind of projects initiated by the Chinese government, not through the traditional BRI project, but it's called Digital Silk Road, by building the cable, undersea cable, to connecting major economies, usually across developing countries. So what's the benefit of doing this? So if you look at Digital Silk Road, it allows China to expand its tech footprint throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe through fiber optics, AI system, and 5G technologies, and making modern technology accessible to emerging economy by offering affordable digital infrastructures. So this is very important to connecting these countries. And this is very much like the ports, but this time they are not shipping goods, they are shipping data, shipping information across major countries. Traditionally, why this one become important? I mean, 5 years ago, I wouldn't say about this, I wouldn't mention these things so importantly. But now, if you look at the AI models or large language models, they are actually become more and more obvious that this new technology will change the world economic landscape. And however, traditionally, this type of model have been kind of monopolized by the well-capitalized firms with enormous budget. For example, they can purchase huge amount of GPU clusters, and they can acquire proprietary data set to build their model, to train their model. As in other words, just until end of last year, AI natural monopoly is inevitable. However, using the reasoning efficiency techniques, early this year, you all see the heated debates about DeepSeek in the public media about R1 model. They only require a very small fraction of the capital investment compared to hundreds of billions of dollars previously spent by the leading firms. And this time, this new technology means that they do not need to rely on the cutting edge American chips. By providing the most efficient algorithm, basic software, you can reduce the dependence on the hardware. So this offers an interesting path for many emerging economies, or even developing countries, to adopt to set up their own AI strategic path. And I just got this interesting figure from The Economist magazine. It shows the cost of output across the three major large language models from OpenAI, Gemini, and DeepSeek. So you can see how much the difference in terms of costs. Previously, if the cost is so high, it is unimaginable for developing country to adopt this type of models. But now the cost become very, very small. I think DeepSeek is not the company that released is not the company released this technology. Last week, Stanford, a team in Stanford University even announces their large language model with $50, not $6 million, but $50 in terms of training a large language model. Of course, depending on how do you value the cost. In other words, by offering this new perception, the new path, relying on better algorithm rather than relying on hardware, this DeepSeek does not only offer this large language model, but offer a new path for developing large language model. So this is something that I would say this is a very interesting development. And why this is so important? Because through the digital Silk Road, the even developing country can leverage upon this kind of new technology to adopt, to catch up with this large language models. So this will be a very new development, I would say. Is some scholars already talking about providing large language model to the Belt Road countries along this Belt Road initiative. So this will be a new thing. Not only, so this is what I said. If you look at the Belt Road initiative, China already talk about making it smaller and beautiful. But in my view, China will in the future make the Belt Road initiative focusing more on the green projects and also digital projects. So this is something really, there is a lot of opportunity for ASEAN economy to leverage upon. And another thing I would like to share with you is about the potential opportunities for ASEAN and China is that they are the largest trade partner of each other last year. And another thing would be given the China intentional industrial upgrading in the near future, China would definitely have to offshore some of this production of labor intensive to other countries. They cannot produce everything by themselves because they will mobilize resources more towards high value added, high tech activities. So the other activities, they either through the external pressure from the US, from European Union, or through its own internal demand, internal structural change, they will probably offshore this kind of task to ASEAN economies through FDIs. So this is the ASEAN FDI inflows by sourcing to 2023. So US is still leading this FDI, is a major FDI investors for ASEAN economies. And the European Union is second, and China, including if you add China and Hong Kong together, it will be the second largest for the ASEAN economies. So this would offer some opportunity for China and ASEAN to deepen their economic integration. And in other words, if you look at Trump's reciprocal tariff recently announced, that could be a potential challenge for ASEAN economy to deal with this new development. Of course, no one knows what we should do at this stage, and no one would know what could be the consequence. But this one basically means that if ASEAN running a huge trade surplus against the United States, US probably want ASEAN to scale down this trade surplus through different measures. That would means that either ASEAN need to buy more from the US or ASEAN had to reduce their export to the US. So either way, it doesn't look very promising for ASEAN economy. So if you look at the recent development announced by the public media or by the state media in China, the most recent discussion is about to increase China's self-reliance on domestic demand. So in other words, China is not anymore, intend to reduce its dependence on trade, but more on domestic markets. This one would potentially offer some opportunity for China to become a major world market rather than world producers. So this could potentially offer some kind of opportunity for ASEAN economy in terms of their export destinations. So I guess this is what I can share with you today. Given the time limits, I will probably stop here.
Thanks. Thanks, Haiping. There was a question in the chat, which you may have sort of addressed slightly. Selwas, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it out?
Yeah. Do you want to, could you please read it? I can see, yeah.
So, how do you see the chips war currently in motion with President Trump wanting to bring in more chips manufacturing to the US? How do you see all of this will impact global supply chains on commodities that it's important for chips, for chip making, be it critical minerals, ingredients, and non-critical minerals? Because China, as you said, have left textile industries and are now moving into those high-end products.
Yeah, this is exactly what I want to mention. Given the time frame, I did talk about. So if you look at the first part of my lecture and second part of my lecture, you can see very opposite feelings. The first part lecture talking about economic slowdown in China, while second part talk about technology advance in China. So clearly, recently there are some Chinese scholars talking about how to synthesize the two facts. So if you look familiar with Chinese economic development path in the last 3 decades, so you can see clearly every 5 years or every 7, 8 years, Chinese economy will experience a substantial structural change, or in other words, substantial industrial upgrading. Of course, when you switch from the traditional sector to the new sector, the traditional sector will decline, a new sector will rise, right? But when the traditional sector decline, while the new sector hasn't yet increased, there will be a period, 1 or 2 years economic slowdown, right? Because economic statistics measured by the value added across different sectors. So, but according to our observation for the Chinese economy in the last 3 decades, every once in a while, Chinese economy will enter into economic boom and slow down. But the slowdown is not the worst period of the time for economy. Actually, it's the best time for the economy to take off another sectors. So real estate sector has been the power engine, the substantial power engine for Chinese economy since China joined WTO at the beginning of 2000s, and has been dominating or supporting Chinese economy growth for almost 2 decades. But of course, if this sector is so powerful, so important, it will attract so much credit going to that. All the loans funds flooding to that sectors. But of course, it means that other sector or emerging sectors will not be able to attract so much funds. By cooling down that sector intentionally through three red lines or through all kinds of moral persuasion or hardline policy, it squeezes the credit going to that sector. So they free up the funds to go into the emerging sectors. A second observation I have to share with you is that if you look at Chinese economic development, there's always a trade-off for the government policy. The first trade-off is traditional, conventional economic trade-off, efficiency versus equity. So whether we make the cake larger or split the cake more equitable across different income groups, right? So, but recently, since the Trump's trade war or U.S. tech war with China, national security versus economic consideration become another trade-off the government is facing. So traditionally, Chinese government only mostly focus on economic consideration. But since 2018, China put the economic security or national security above economic growth. So that's why China tried to slow down economic growth by putting more restrictions on the conventional economic sector, putting a lot of effort to developing new or cutting-edge technologies to reduce the technology dependence on the US, especially. So this explains very interesting debate about state advance, private sector retreat in the last 6 years or 7 years. But if you look at the state media early this week, China start to change gears from this week onwards. It start to emphasize the private sector, the importance of private sector in the national economy. I think on Monday, President Xi actually hold a meeting with the leading figures of private sectors, talking about encouraging private sector growth. And this is a very important signal to the rest of the world about China will re-embrace the economic consideration above its national security. After achieving most of the goal in the Made in China 2025, it has secured its technology self-sufficiency criteria they set 10 years ago. Now it's time to switch back to the private sector dominating security concerns. And of course, if you look at what Vice President of U.S. Speech at the Munich security conferences, it's probably the U.S. also have take different approach in the coming years with China and with other allies. So that also gives China some kind of confidence to develop its economic economy rather than emphasize too much on security concerns, right? So this is what I can share with you. If you look at tech war and chip wars, I think China is even today, China still cannot produce the cutting edge chips, but it can produce the chip that used for mass purposes, right? It's not cutting 1 nanometer or 2 nanometer chips, it's still not feasible. but they are catching up very quickly to 7 nanometer or 14 nanometer, which has the largest application purposes. I think that's a very good question. Let me see the next chat question. Yeah, I mean, chip war is not directed because China does not have to be producing the cutting edge chips for its own purposes. Yeah, okay.
I think we probably have 1 or 2 minutes for any last questions. Does anyone else want to ask Haiping anything? You can either put it in the chat or turn your microphone on or raise your hand.
Okay, good.
Okay, and just a note also that we posted some Haiping provided some good questions that you can reflect on after this discussion. So you could look at those questions on Canvas as well. I think there's one last question from Pin.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question posted on chat box. So I think Trump's reciprocal tariff on the rest of the world, including to China, I think even before Trump got reelected, I look at some of the Chinese scholars, their interview basically says that China already be prepared, even if Trump get reelected. So in other words, in terms of many of the dimension, basically the chip war was the major shock to China during the Trump 1.0. Right. So now Trump 2.0, China still already addressed some of the bottleneck technology for chip production, even though it is not producing the cutting edge, but for the most of the purposes it needed, it doesn't restrict China's demand for chips. So this already solved the problem. For other things, I think this is very, it remains to be observed how much the Trump's tariff would affect China's export to the US. But very clearly, if you look at the Peterson Institute, Mary Lovely recently published a very interesting post talking about the effects of U.S. tariff on U.S. price level. So clearly, U.S. tariff will not hurt its trade partner. Will hurt its trade partner, of course, but it will potentially hurt U.S. Consumers as well as U.S. firms more importantly, including the aluminium, including steel, this heavy the material for their manufacturing. Because one of the slogans for Trump's trade policy is to boost U.S. manufacturing. If you impose too much tariff on the materials, it will actually raise the production cost for the U.S. firms. How could U.S. firm export on the global market at a competitive price if its cost is now hiking by 20%, 25%, which is most of the Trump policy looks quite, on the first side, looks quite appealing for their shareholder, the voters. But if you look at deeperly, many of the policy doesn't serve for the purposes. So this is a very clear, we already learned that in Trump 1.0, 80 years ago. Yeah, but I think the Trump trade policy will not only affect the U.S. economy, but will have substantial effects on trade diversion effect that will reshape the global trading system, that change the pattern of trade flows across different major players, including ASEAN, China, European unions. So,
okay.
Yeah, very well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Haiping. That was a lot of information, but I do appreciate that we're in a rapidly changing environment. So I think it was really helpful to kind of pull together some of those different trends and challenges and opportunities. So yes, thank you very much. So we will have another guest lecturer with us in the second half. So we will say harimai. But thank you, Haiping, and go well. We will see you soon. And
thank you.
The rest of us will have a break for 15 minutes, Gay?
Yep. Yes. You need to be back by 3:40 p.m. for the next session with Dr. Stephen Oaks. Thank you so much, Haiping.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ka kite.
Okay, everybody, so make sure you're back before 3:40 for your next session. Break time.
Share. How's that?
Good.
Everybody cool?
Yes, perfect. So yeah, if everyone is is back, then I would just like to welcome, excuse me, Associate Professor Steve Noakes from our the Politics and International Relations, let's just call it a department for in the School of Social Science. And also the director of the China Studies Center here at the university. Oh, we haven't put this question up yet, Lucia. We'll get to it later in the session. So without further ado, I don't want to use up any more time. Steve, thank you very much for being here. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne and Gay, for having me today. And it's really nice to virtually be meeting all of you. How many people have I got all up? It looks like about 20, 21, something like that. Okay. And if you have a moment to just sort of chime in on the chat, it'd be good for me to have a good sense of the points of origin represented in the, well, room, I suppose we can say. We're all in different rooms, but you understand my meaning. Would you mind just, if you have a free hand there, entering your home country or possibly where you're seated right now into the chat there? I see there's some from Indonesia, some Vietnam, there's a Cambodia. Just be good for me to see, have a little quick look at who all is in the room and where everybody is coming from. As I imagine you're aware, there's some tendency in these kinds of discussions for people to speak in generalities, but in ways that sort of assume there isn't that much variation within a region of the Earth. And I'm telling you, as a political scientist, that's technically impossible. There is going to be massive amounts of variation in attitudes and postures and preconceived notions and all sorts of things as we go through the hour together. And I think that's normal and it's how it should be. The important thing here is that we learn from each other. If you're wondering why I talk like this, it's because I'm originally from a small town, well, medium-sized town, I suppose, in southwestern Ontario, Canada. I moved to New Zealand to do the job I now do at the University of Auckland almost 12 years ago. And if you can see the map on the bottom left there, that is a zoomed in shot that I took of a road atlas of the Great Lakes region of North America, if that makes any sense to anybody. I mean, I'm from a small town called Brantford, which you can see just in sort of the bottom, is very small type at the bottom left of the map. It's about an hour drive west of Toronto, Ontario, if that helps. If it doesn't, no worries, but that's the frame of reference that I bring to these discussions. And I mention it mostly because I'm thinking of just now about the type of hometown I have. It's one of those places, if I may say, where success kind of isn't cool. Maybe you understand what I'm talking about, maybe you don't, but there aren't a lot of people growing up in my hometown that have ability with Chinese language. It's certainly quite uncommon among, Caucasian families of British ancestry. My parents weren't diplomats or missionaries or anything like that. And so all of the China-oriented knowledge and the knowledge of geopolitics that I kind of gained is something that happened to me much later. University was a really transformative thing for me. I was an undergraduate student at a university in Canada called Queen's. For international audiences, I almost always say the Canadian Queen's because there's also an Irish Queen's. There's a Queen's Belfast as well. That one's not me. Queen's Canada is in the city of Kingston, which is in the far right corner of the lake that you can see in the little map there. It's got a little airport icon beside it, just where the lake narrows into the St. Lawrence River that then flows out towards Montreal, and then on eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. I was, after that, a master's student at one time at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And then I had a postdoctoral position at the University of Toronto. In between that, I was a visiting fellow at Fudan University, which is one of the large, fairly prestigious research universities in mainland China. Since then, I've held a range of fellowships at places like Peking University and Taida in Taipei as well. As I say, I've been at the University of Auckland since 2013. So that's coming up on about 12 years. I didn't have, as I say, any Chinese language ability at all until I was well into my 20s. I originally came to the knowledge that I have during the period when I lived in Vancouver. I don't know if you've all experienced this in your professional lives, but I was paralyzed almost by what we might call imposter syndrome at that stage of my life. When I was a new graduate student, I was convinced that everyone was qualified to be there except for me, and that everyone else knew things I didn't, and that in admitting me, there had been some sort of clerical mistake. I didn't know that that's not how it works until much later. But what that really meant was I had to go from scratch at that point in my life and try to cultivate some area of expertise that I didn't have through some other line of professional experience. And what that was for me was an afternoon of Christmas shopping on Robson Street in Vancouver. And it abuts the art gallery in Vancouver, where there was a Falun Gong demonstration. Falun Gong, if you're not familiar, is a now banned religious movement from mainland China that has a very strong presence in Chinese expatriate communities all around the world. And so I was able to watch that protest. And I remember thinking on the bus on the way home, well, that might be a fun project for somebody. So all these years later, that's where it began. That's about me. I'm just going to move my little box of all your pictures here so that I can actually see my own graphics. So I'm going to show you some information that's been collected in the New Zealand context, and you may have your own thoughts about how it applies to or differs from the experiences you're familiar with in your own settings. So something like 59%, 6 in 10, roughly, New Zealanders say that they know a fair amount about Asia. This is information collected by an entity called the Asia New Zealand Foundation, and they conduct this survey every year. And so they go to the average New Zealander and they ask this question, would you please self-assess your knowledge of Asia? And a majority think they know quite a bit. Hold that thought, because it's a big lie. Most people actually don't know nearly as much as they think they do. And it's borne out in some of the other statistics that come through in that same survey. What happens is, I got one out of order there. The term Asia gets muddled up with a bunch of others. It's not always clear who is thinking of what when they use the term Asia. What we do know is that China is the thing most New Zealanders most closely associate with Asia. If we were to produce a Venn diagram of images that pop into New Zealanders' heads when they hear the term Asia, the China circle would overlap to a very serious degree. Okay? But that doesn't necessarily mean people have positive feelings about China. In fact, if anything, it's fairly ambivalent. And you can see that in some of the figures here. At the very top, which countries are friends to New Zealand? Most people agree New Zealand's on very good terms with Japan. Very few people claim, and I'm looking at the right-hand column now, that Japan is somehow a threat to New Zealand, right? The very similar figures most of the way down the chart there until you get to that last one. It's weird, right? Have a quick look at that. Which countries are friends to New Zealand? 1 in 3 New Zealanders thinks that China is a friend to New Zealand, whatever that means. Almost exactly the same number say China is a threat to New Zealand. So we might say that public opinion on China in this part of the world is quite divided. Without pretending to know you or any of the other frames of reference in the room, I'd be willing to hazard a guess that's probably true of most of your points of origin as well. It's actually a little on the rare side these days to encounter public sentiment in any given country that is uniformly in favor of China or uniformly not in favor of China. There tends to be quite a split. No one's quite sure what to think. In other words, there's an awful lot of misperception out there about what China actually is. There is, at least in New Zealand, quite a bit of sentiment that China exercises by far the most influence of any Asian country over what happens in New Zealand. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which I will talk about in a bit more detail as we go through things here. Most of that, though, has to do with the fact that New Zealand China is New Zealand's largest trading partner now. So what that really means is that New Zealanders are, as I say, in a quandary. Imagine a situation where you are very heavily dependent on a country for the health of your economy, and at the same time, for security reasons, over a third of those people in your country view that same trade partner as a threat. That is the situation that New Zealand is now in. There is probably, as I say, and you can all correct me on this, I'd be interested to learn. I imagine there is some truth to that in a lot of your home countries as well. A sense that the future of the global economy, the global environment is all tied to what happens in China, but still a profound sense of confusion or mistrust or uncertainty about how we feel towards China. I'm just going to take a quick second and have a look-see at what people have entered here in the chat. We've got Gay on the presentations. Can you repeat the question? Okay, so this is, Indonesia, there we are. Lots from Vietnam. Okay, thank you for sending that. So what I wanted to spend the bulk of our time on today then is just discussing as a group what China even is, or what we think it is. Because my experience here is that there is a pretty profound gap between perceptions or impressions of China and the realities of China on the ground. It is very, very common to hear talk of China as a threat. Sometimes I hear people saying things like, oh, China's taking over, or it's rivaling the United States, or often it's my mother saying these things. She has this very profound mistrust of China. It's very common. And my experience with China is that because it's opaque and not transparent most of the time, there are good reasons for people's suspicions, and yet it gets a little less threatening the more you understand what it is and why it operates the way it does. All this is to say, enhancing familiarity with China is a good thing because it can help us to put some of our preconceived notions and even fears in some better context. In an environment where, like New Zealand, where economic dependence is muddled up with threat perception and knowledge of a context remains low or is outdated in some way, there is this general tendency for people to simply fall back on what they think they know, which is a fancy way of me saying people stereotype kind of a lot. So just I'll give you an anecdote from earlier this morning. I was speaking with someone this morning who about our respective jobs. And this person said, oh, Chinese politics. That's interesting. You know, I traveled to China last year on business with my husband, and I was surprised because I didn't see anyone at all wearing those, you know, those gray high collar tunics that they wear. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course you didn't, because the Communist Party uniform has not been worn as everyday dress for 45 years. Once a year at a party plenum, Xi Jinping will put on his uniform, but that's about it. They wear coat and tie, same as politicians all over the world otherwise. My point is that people tend to have this impression of what China was and not necessarily a great impression of what it is now. It is similar in some ways to places like late authoritarian Mexico, much closer to that than its own totalitarian former self. You know, in the mid 1970s, China looked very similar to what North Korea is now. That's not the case anymore, and it's quite a long time since that happened. In places like New Zealand, people hear words like the Communist Party of China, and immediately it takes them to a place mentally that has not really resembled the reality of what the Chinese Communist Party is for a very long time. So I put this slide together and I emptied my head. What do people think of when they think of the Chinese party state? So I came up with a little bit of a list there. And if you have something you'd like to add, a different type of impression or something that is slightly different from what's up there, please chime in on the chat. Here are some things that people tend to think when they think of the Chinese party state. First of all, they sort of see it as a monolith. It's very common for people to assume that China is under the thumb of a dictator, and that communist party states like China's are very cohesive, and because outspokenness is discouraged, the whole place tends to think and act as one. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a little while. How about this second one, that China is stable and orderly and well institutionalized? Check out the picture on the right-hand side there. You've got the Pudong skyline in Shanghai. If you've been there, it looks a little bit like Singapore, right? The architecture and the engineering is incredible. It makes Manhattan look passé, right? Someone sent me this screenshot. I've had it on my phone. Someone at the New Zealand Trade Commission said, for reference, the Shanghai Tower is double the size of Auckland's Sky Tower, right? And if you've ever been to Pudong, you've seen these buildings in person. It's unbelievably clean. It's very safe. And people get this impression, therefore, that China is a very stable and orderly and well-institutionalized place. We sometimes hear about the party state as being adaptive, that it is actually quite dynamic and capable of change. Not only that, it can change and execute preferences much more quickly and efficiently than any democracy could. Partly this one might be true. Things can indeed be accomplished quite quickly in China's environment. Major capital construction projects do not take anywhere close to the amount of time in the Chinese context that they do in, say, a Western liberal democracy. In Auckland, New Zealand, the local council has been talking about building a light rail system to the airport for about 5 decades now, and it's never happened. That's the sort of thing that gets built in the Chinese context, possibly within a matter of months. If it took a couple of years, that would be the extent of it, right? So there's a sense that China is quite adaptive. It's capable of change. And it's true, the world is not as full of communist regimes as it used to be. So why is it that China's survived, whereas so many others did not? The answer might be that it's adaptive. It's more capable of change than was, say, the Soviet Union, or more capable of managing that change than other communist states in history would have been. How about this one? The idea that China is developed. This one might be my favorite in the whole list. You pick up a Western newspaper, and it's going to say something like, "World's second largest economy is now closing in on the United States." That China has this rapid level of development. It is true, the pace of the development change is pretty quick, but it's not as developed as you think. In fact, it refers to itself as a middle income country and freely acknowledges its own ongoing development challenges. These are things I'm going to speak about in a bit more detail as the slides go on. Related to that developmental angle, we often hear that China is a rising world power. Probably all of you who deal with China in whatever respect in your day-to-day jobs will have been familiar with a flagship foreign policy of Xi Jinping known as the Belt and Road Initiative. When it was conceived originally in 2013, it was called One Belt, One Road, Yidailu. We often have this sense that China is a rising world power. I can present you with some information over the next 20, 25 minutes or so to demonstrate it's not quite what you think it is. Finally, and this is again my mother talking, this sense that China is brutal and threatening. People living in democracies in the Western world often have this impression, mostly because when other communist regimes around the world were crumbling in the late 1980s and early 1990s, China's would-be overthrow of its regime was broadcast via what we've come to know as the Tank Man picture. It was one of the very first popular democratic revolutions, ultimately put down by the state, that was broadcast that widely on television, on magazine covers, and so forth. And that image of China, of a single person standing before a column of tanks, has never really faded in the global imagination. So these are all things, common impressions that people have of China. They're not exactly wrong, and they don't come from nowhere, but neither are they exactly right. And getting this right actually matters, because the more we examine China, the less threatening it seems. And I have to say also, the less stable and developed it appears to be. Right. Well, I think before we do anything else, we'd better have a bit of a chat about what exactly a party state is. I know that there are folks from Vietnam on the call. In terms of the structure and ideological origins of a party state, there probably are no two systems in the world more alike in terms of where they've come from than China and Vietnam. They differ now in important ways, but ideologically they emanate from the same root. A party state, under this definition, is a set of institutions in which a single party monopolizes politics and bans other parties or excludes them from power. These kinds of party-based systems are one type of non-democratic regime. It's a category that would include many other subtypes, military dictatorships, for example, or various types of monarchies, religious oligarchy, perhaps, in the case of somewhere like Iran. The Chinese party state is a very special subtype of the party state genus, based on that old-time Marxist-Leninist framework. If we were having this conversation 50 years ago, it would have referenced half the globe. Now there are 5 nominally Marxist-Leninist states left on Earth, and most of them, with the exception, I guess, of North Korea, have significantly reformed from within. It is completely normal, psychologically normal for you or I or anyone to apply the frames or expectations that we have of China based on experiences in our own country. So in my case, I've lived in Canada and New Zealand. That means the experience of life in a liberal democracy. I meet people all the time that do this. They often are surprised when China doesn't function in the way they expect a country to function, because all they know is a liberal democratic system. People look for things in the world that confirm patterns they're familiar with and comfortable with. It's a totally normal psychological phenomenon, but it comes with an important liability. When you do that, you can actually miss a great deal of the reality of what is happening on the ground. And so when I meet people who say, well, I've grown up in New Zealand and I expected China to function or social conventions to operate as they do in New Zealand in China, and then that turns out not to be true, I'll say, yeah, it's because you're projecting. We all do it. We're human. No harm, no foul, right? It's not about passing judgment on those people. We all carry unconscious biases, but when we do, we can miss much of China's reality. So is everyone with me so far? I feel like I should just take a quick moment and check in with the chat. Have I got any further questions on the chat there at the moment, or
Not
not
at the
really?
moment, Steve.
Okay.
I think they're still good.
Okay, thanks, guys. So on this notion of China being stable and orderly, and starting to pick apart some of those established assumptions about what China is and how it works, I wanted to introduce you to a concept. We call it fragmented authoritarianism. This is a very, very well-established and, well, I might even say old premise in the professional study of China's political system. It is not clear or coherent. It does not think and act as a monolith, not at all. In fact, it's quite disorderly and chaotic in its way. There's a saying, and I've given you the English rendering of it here. What the center mandates, the local finds a way to ignore. Right? It's an axiom that is pervasive throughout China's fragmented authoritarian system. It's actually quite hard at the county or township or village level to see the preferences of China's central government realized. There is a related problem of intra-party factionalism. I very commonly meet people who believe that the Chinese Communist Party thinks and acts as one. That's not true, not at all. Like all political parties everywhere, the Communist Party of China has wings. It has factions. It has people who hate each other and historically have tried to murder each other, sometimes successfully. Intra-party factionalism remains a significant feature of the party now. Some out there in my audience may be familiar with the anti-corruption campaigns underway in China, or disciplinary campaigns underway in China. Those things exist for a reason, and it's not because the Communist Party of China is very orderly internally, right? It's because it's not. It's because those problems, if left unchecked, could actually sink the entire enterprise. She knows this, and being a strong ruler, is working to correct the problem of intra-party factionalism with greater anti-corruption measures and disciplinary measures. Sometimes you hear this referred to as ideological hygiene, enforcing the correct opinion, that sort of thing. Where it's actually not possible to see the central government's objectives realized at the grassroots, the president has taken to blaming this on what he calls two-faced men, people who are traitors to China and the revolutionary cause by not doing as the center instructs them to do. He would never speak that way if it was simply a norm of the system that the center can get whatever it wants. It's not true at all. China is a remarkably large and difficult to govern place. That is the use of local actors as scapegoats. I should say one more thing about intra-party factionalism. So every once in a while, there are changes and a new faction arises. In the 1980s, for example, the oil faction was in fashion and powerful within the party. And they drilled over 8 million square miles and found not a drop. And so that was really the end of the oil faction in the party. Today, the main fault lines within the party are those who, in the West, we would call them Nepo babies, or in China, the fashionable term is princelings. They got their position because their father, and it's always a father, pretty much never a mother, they got their position because their dad was a big somebody. Xi Jinping is a princeling. He has his role and the advantages he's gained in his march up the ladder of the party because of who his parents are. The other side of it, they don't really have a name. We would just call them the non-princelings, or I don't know, the people who did it the old-fashioned way. People who made their name through party-based organizations like the Communist Youth League or the Young Pioneers or something like that. You're either a princeling or you're not. You're a Nepo baby or you're not in China's current factional politics. All of this is to say, China is not as well institutionalized or as entrenched in stable procedures as people tend to think it is, right? The rules of this game matter until they don't. There is a very strong element of unpredictability. The regime itself is very strong and stable. The balance of interests competing within it is not at all. Well, what this really means is that the Communist Party of China is, in reality, a giant Rolodex. Do people know what a Rolodex is? I guess I should say a contact list for people who don't know what a Rolodex is. That's what the Communist Party of China is. Think of it as a big contact list. It governs succession politics and really contributes to that sense of instability, of poor institutionalization. Everybody who gets ahead in the Communist Party of China does so by personal ties. In the West, we wouldn't call it that. We would call it networking or something like that. But the truth here is that people join the Communist Party of China for the same reason everybody, even in democracies, join political parties, for the connections. The entire thing turns on connections. The word in Chinese would be guanxi. You could almost substitute a term like social capital or possibly patron-client relations or something like that. You got to be somebody's favorite. There's no primary process, as in, let's say, the Democratic Party in the United States to select a leader. You can only get ahead by making friends with the right people, by going to the right schools. That's a big one. You got to be part of the cool kids club, in other words. And as I say, that crackdown on corruption is really about managing this balance of or imbalance of interests within the party. The name and the tactic officially given to it, or the objective assigned to those anti-corruption initiatives, is to catch tigers and flies. This is the language they use. A tiger is someone who, well, a tiger is an apex predator, right? A very difficult animal to catch, but an important one. When they talk about catching tigers, I think they're really referencing people like the two in the pictures at the right there. On the top, you've got Bo Xilai, who used to be the party boss in the central city of Chongqing, and you've got Zhou Yangkang, who was on the bottom there, who was at one time the head of the national security apparatus. Why would I say these people were tigers? Well, in Zhou Yangkang's case, the man on the bottom there, he is now serving a life term for his involvement in a corruption scandal. A similar event in the United States would be something like the FBI director or the head of the CIA going away for the rest of their life. That's a big get. It's going to make newspaper headlines that that person got that sentence. Catching flies, well, that's an important corruption challenge too, but it happens at the grassroots. That's a traffic cop having to be paid a bribe to overlook a speeding fine, something like that. It may not grab newspaper headlines, but it's part of that corruption problem that plagues the Chinese Communist Party. There are several different
Steve, I think you have
Yes.
a question now in the chat.
Oh, I do. Hang on a sec. Let's go to the chat. Let me go down to the bottom here. How has the fragmented nature of China's governance affected its ability to handle recent economic challenges, such as the real estate crisis and slowing GDP growth? You're going to hate this answer. But I'm going to tell you the truth against my better judgment. I don't know, and nobody does. I can speculate for you. And by speculating, I guess I would say that it actually intensifies the pressure on Xi to manage various crises, whether they are economic, such as the ones you mentioned, or social. It creates an enormous amount of performance pressure, which is increasingly concentrated on the shoulders of a single person. That can be, and I'm speaking as a political scientist who has watched lots of regimes collapse, that can be very dangerous. It used to be the case in China that you could more effectively manage crises of various types by actually diminishing or managing the fragmented nature of politics with patronage appointments. Xi does not do that. Okay, so for example, it used to be much more common for Chinese leaders to make appointments to the Politburo Standing Committee, the group of 7 to 9 people who run China. It used to be very important to get regional balance in that. Not anymore. What has happened instead is Xi has taken the power unto himself and strengthened the anti-corruption and discipline initiatives. It's a pretty bold gambit, and the stakes are high. I can see why he did it. There is a risk that by placating or seeking to represent the factions in some way, you run the risk of only deepening the fissures that are already there. Xi is effectively trying to paper over them with harsh measures. I can see why you do it, but it does create a ton of pressure on that single person. It's very rickety, if that makes sense. The costs of getting it wrong can be very, very high. And I think the closest I've seen China come to that was about 2.5 to 3 years ago, right as the lockdown measures were at their height in COVID-19. There was video that surfaced on the internet of people in Shanghai out banging pots and pans on the balconies of their apartments. Why? Because grocery rations had not been properly distributed. People were locked in their homes and were unable to actually obtain enough food. This actually was a crisis of pretty monumental concern for people like Xi, because, well, it turns out it's very hard to home deliver groceries to 25 million people. It's logistically pretty challenging, right? And people got mad. This is a setting that in the summer of 1960 experienced the single worst humanitarian disaster in the history of the world by body count. I'm talking about the Great Leap Famine. So people remember what it's like in China to not have enough food. And when you see that your government promised it to you and then it couldn't give it to you, it actually makes that fragmented element of politics much more difficult to manage. What they were able to do in that particular case is find a subordinate to push the blame onto. If I could give any of you a valuable piece of professional advice, it's this: when you make a mistake, when you overpromise and underdeliver in some aspect of your job, find a weaker person you can blame for your mistake, because that's what's been done here. All of that I'm describing was pushed onto the two-faced men, local officials who weren't doing as she directed, right? As long as you've got that, you're okay. I know that's a very long-winded answer to an incredibly complicated question, but there it is. I mean, the best I can say is that she is trying something that has not really been tried since about 1976, and China is a very different place now. I wanted to mention these various forms of corruption to you, just quite quickly. I'm going to go through what I've got here. People talk of corruption in China a lot, but it's not always clear what that means. So there are several different types. You have embezzlement, right? Skimming off the top. Misappropriation of public funds, which would extend not to graft or theft always, but also to extravagant or wasteful spending. It includes now things that would have been very common in China's past, such as public officials spending money on alcohol at a dinner where they're entertaining foreign business people or diplomats. At one point, it was very normal for tobacco to be included. Not anymore. You can't use government money to buy cigarettes for people now. Bribery or influence peddling, selling a promise of access. That's a very common one. There is also, outside big cities mostly, quite widespread evidence of state collusion with various organized crime entities. Most commonly, this happens where the population is quite sparse and there isn't the money to hire sufficient police. Where that happens, it's actually remarkably common for local governments to pay armed gangs to police for them. They invest in extra legal protection, counterfeiting of various sorts, piracy of brands, not so much money, but patents, copyrights, things like that, kickbacks from semi-legal businesses, most often government-backed casinos, as well as various forms of money laundering. Who exactly is doing all this corrupt stuff in China? Well, overwhelmingly, it's local politics where it happens. It's not generally the case that very high-ranking officials are implicated. Most cases occur at the level of the village committee. Those people, believe it or not, have been elected to those posts in China directly since 1980. This is yet another way in which people find out that China is not what they thought it was. It's not like China never holds elections. There have been millions of local elections held since the early 1980s in the Vote for Your Chief campaigns. I like this one. This goes to the point of China not being as developed as you sometimes think it is. We hear these things a lot, that it's the second largest economy by GDP, that China is a middle income country. That is a very specific definition, by the way. A middle income country is a place where household income has actually surpassed a base level of 16,000 US dollars per annum, which means that if we're using the World Bank's data, China is in the same economic bracket as places like Egypt or Venezuela. And that's good in a sense, right? Because 15 years ago, when China was below that threshold, it would have been in a low income developing country category, which would have meant back then its closest economic peers were places like Botswana and Namibia. Okay, nobody anywhere thinks Botswana or Namibia or Egypt are global economic powers. It is profoundly misleading to claim that China has anything like the developmental level of the United States. It simply isn't true. What is true is that China's wealth tends to be concentrated on the eastern coast, and that in general, as China develops, its wealth is very, very unevenly distributed. There is a long-standing problem with declining rural wages in China. One simply cannot make money as they used to on the homestead in China. And so this has produced a range of developmental challenges, all stemming from runaway urbanization. The city's actually getting far too large to be effectively managed or governed. This map conveys the point I'm making in a slightly different way. There are indeed parts of China which are incredibly well developed, right? And mostly those are places along the eastern seaboard. So Guangdong down south here, where I'm moving the cursor just now, has a GDP similar to what you would find in Australia. Guangzhou is quite a wealthy city, by and large. Shanghai is also doing quite well. Remember when I spoke about Pudong a few minutes ago? It has a GDP roughly equivalent to what you'd find in Geneva, Switzerland. Quite wealthy. In general, the further west in China you travel, the more you see that unwind. There are pockets of affluence. This industrialized area up here, quite similar to New Zealand, right? But then you get out west. Is Bolivia said to be catching up to the United States economically? Obviously not. What about Senegal? Does anybody think Senegal or Iraq have anything like the development level of the United States? No, of course not. So it's wildly simplistic to claim that China is catching up or rivaling the United States in any significant way. We tend to talk in these broad generalizations, but China's too complicated for that. What you see in Pudong New Area, this place that has a GDP similar to Switzerland, that's not all China is. It is China, but it's not only China. It's not China any more than Manhattan is the United States, right? And this is sort of implicit in the remarks I just made. Income inequality is actually pretty high, but not moving. There hasn't been the emphasis in the last decade on redistribution that China has had in the past. And this is jarring still. This is a place that in living memory had cradle to grave Marxist-Leninist style social provisions. China has experienced markets the hard way in some respects since they were introduced in the autumn of 1978. Finally, I wanted to mention this point about China's military rise. Remember at the very outset, I had said some things about China as a rising world power and all of that. And that's a lot of where the threat perception comes from. It's not necessarily all it's cracked up to be. This graphic is, I mean, it's public and it's a little older now, but it makes the point that I'm hoping to make. The red there is the point that is the bit that worries the United States Indo-Pacific Command. You can see it at the top there, Indo-PACOM. They're the ones who produced the graphic. They're based at Camp Smith in Hawaii, the same place that in the early 1940s experienced a bombing raid by the Empire of Japan. What they've shown here, and which they think is cause for panic, is that there are significantly more assets listed in red than in blue. Okay, and we're all looking at it. That is what that looks like. But again, it's misleading. Why? Because included among the blue are only those assets which are assets of the US Department of Defense. It does not include assets which belong to US allies and treaty partners in the Indo-Pacific theater. So those blue graphics that you see there, that doesn't include boats and planes from the Republic of Korea. It does not include boats and planes from Japan. It does not include any of that from Australia. Okay. So the graphic is a bit misleading, but you got to pay attention to what's actually being said here. I think what that really means is that those allies and treaty partners around the world of the United States need to be treated with respect, particularly in the Indo-Pacific theater. And I think it's a very, very open question as to whether the new person in the White House, who incidentally is also the previous person in the White House, is interested in doing that. This is part of the reason that I assigned through Gay those couple of reference articles that I did. I was hoping that people could think about some of the things I said and what this might mean when we think about the structure of geopolitics in the world. I wanted to, my purpose here was really to dispel a few misconceptions, to rethink a little bit about what China is and what we imagine it to be. And there are two, right? One image of China is that it's stable and orderly and increasingly wealthy. And the other, though, is quite different. It's decentralized and underdeveloped and institutionally incoherent and rife with corruption, and has all these sorts of development challenges that typically aren't reported in the English-speaking world, at least. I wanted to put the following questions to you, knowing what we now know about China's self and how we think about geopolitics. First of all, to set the stage for that, what are some of the most common perceptions or beliefs about what China is that you experience at home? I mean, what do your various governments have to say about this? Some will be relatively China friendly. Some might be a little bit more China phobic, but it is commonly thought that relatively small countries have to align themselves with one side of a geopolitical dispute or the other. I'm wondering if that's really true. Think, if you would, for a few minutes in these groups that I think Suzanne is going to put you in the breakout rooms, about this issue of bipolarity. Does your home country have to choose? Do you think you have to choose between China or the West? Or can you chart some kind of independent course that walks the line between the two? If that could be done, how or why could it be done? I am completely agnostic on the answers, but I consider it a big part of my job as an educator to unwind people's preconceived notions. It so happens that it's my job to do this with respect to China. That's my role at the university. But for someone else, maybe they're teaching a course in American foreign policy. America's a big and complicated place. It's often not reducible to a one-liner you could read on a cereal box or something like that. And so it can be quite dangerous and misleading to form impressions around those kinds of oversimplifications. Suzanne, can I ask you to do the task of sorting people?
Yep, done. I'm ready to go.
Cool.
Are you going to broadcast that to the breakout rooms? I've pasted those questions into that shared Google Doc if you all want to work on that. Otherwise, we can broadcast the questions to the breakout room as well.
Okay. I think given I have 4:33.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think probably 10 to 12 minutes might do for the breakout room component. And then we've got a little bit more time for banter afterwards.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll open the rooms now.
Thank you very much.
And Steve, you have a question in the chat in case you want to look at it while they're on their breakout
I'll have
rooms.
a look see. BRI is Dutch Rap. Yeah. Okay. Right. Now I'm going to stop share. I think that's the thing to do here for a moment, just so I can get a better view of everybody. There we are. All right. Now we had 4 breakout rooms, correct? A total of 4 with 6 to 7 in each one.
Yeah, five, mostly five.
Okay. In that case, could I ask, starting in numerical order, a representative from room 1, what did you discuss? What kind of ideas were out there in your group? Can we hear from group 1 first?
Hello, I'm Ricky. I'm from
Ricky.
Group 1 representative. Yeah. As we discussed that the China's perspective on for Vietnam, there's a positive and negative. For the negative, the Vietnamese they have a negative perspective on the China Sea because, as you know, that China is hot hot topic for the Southeast Asian discussion on the Asian meeting, something like that. And in terms of trading partner, Vietnamese and Cambodia have a good perspective on that. On Cambodian, for Cambodia, China is number 1 trading partner on terms of trading and investment in Cambodia. On the negative perspective for the Cambodia, due to the China money laundering and online scrambling, human trafficking, something like that for the Cambodia's perspective. And whether the question as whether we choose West or China is for in my opinion, there in a diplomatic we cannot say there's no enemy, there's no enemy, no friend. So whether whoever invests in Cambodia, we try to get we try to whatever we try to get a benefit of for Cambodia. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's on the final question. That is what I imagined to be the case in Cambodia and for probably lots of other places as well. I've lived in New Zealand for 12 years, and there's a lot of talk about an independent foreign policy, and I believe it's real. I just don't really understand how or why it works. I've never really known. Could we hear from a representative of Group 2? Is there someone from Group 2?
Room 2 is Chloe, Davin, Dong Pashan, Poch, Ain, and Tigar. That's your group.
Can you give us a sense of the tone of the discussion in that room?
Yes, we did have a discussion. But it just like represent from group 1, also from Cambodia, so share the same almost the same thoughts as group 1. So that's why I want other to share a little bit. Like, and maybe you can share about Malaysia.
Like we discussed in our group, China is nice, but at the same time, they are softly threaten us without weapon, but through the agreement. They give us a good benefit, but at the same time, threaten us for the interest. So yeah, currently Malaysia facing that like now recently we are in the 70% in a fast train, speed train from KL to the Perlis, to the our south and north, and this is come from the China development. China give us in a very good agreement without us notice. It's very not straightforward agreement until that's finished 50%. We are like feeling threatened because we need to follow all the costing and suddenly become double. And then if this project is finished next year, all the price are from China, which is they will giving what's the fixed price, and if they want to increase, that's up to their government. That's not really good for Malaysian perspective.
Thank you very much. I think what you're saying is a very common sentiment. You're not the only one. You know, I gave a similar talk before Christmas to a group from various Pacific Island countries. Almost all of them said some version of that. It's a very common tale. Is there a group 3 representative we could have? Did you
Maybe
find something
I
similar?
will represent our group. So we discussed about the first and second question, like how about our country's perspective, and most of us agree that oh yeah, we have Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. We agree that mostly our relations with China is related to economic, for it's our biggest partner in trade and investment. And then for the third question, well, actually, this is from the perspective of Indonesia, since it's currently happening in our foreign policy. Like we choose to
Right.
join BRICS and OECD, and then it gets yeah, it gets some critics
Yeah.
about how can you choose the two alliances, like because our foreign policy principle is free and active. It means like we can choose any alliances that will benefit our national interest. It doesn't mean that we have not choose one of it. So yeah, US and its alliances can be our important partner in defense and another strategic alliances, and also China will become the important partner in economic in terms of trade, investment, and then about the infrastructure cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm hearing roughly similar things, and I thought that might happen across the groups. Is there someone from the fourth group we might have a couple of moments from?
Okay, group 4, Aliza, Mary Shane, Naksaifong, Oktia, and Finn. Anybody from the group?
Well, I may share some discussion from our group. I think that a lot of similar ideas that I have talked about. But from my point of view, our relationship between with China is the relationship between a big country and a small country as neighbors. And that relationship remain for a very long time. And many implications may come from that. And that means that small country always being impacted in many aspects, like from politics, economics, cultural. Yes. And also a lot of we have negative and also positive comments on that. For a lot of things that we can learn from China, especially when we share the same type of politics, the socialism politic, and especially we can learn how they remain high growth rate in very long term and build up the infrastructure. It's very hard for Vietnam also and other countries also. But we also there's always the view that we have to be careful, assess the benefits and costs in relationship with China. Yeah. And that's some point from my view. And if any one from my team would like to share, please be ready to share. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm hearing, and I thought this might be the case, quite similar impressions that China is viewed as being a potential source of opportunities and even benefits, and that's good, but you've really got to weigh those up because it's a new economic power or emergent economic power, and we don't really have a good sense yet of what the long-term impacts might be, perhaps unintended consequences. In my job, you know, and I expect many of yours as well, assigning intentionality to the actions of any government is probably one of the most difficult things you could ever do. And what's making this is making me think of a question that I got in the chat just as everyone was going to the breakout rooms. Someone wrote, Adolf wrote, Ronnie Harpan said, what is your opinion on BRI as debt trap? And I think this question kind of speaks to a lot of the concerns that are being voiced now. This idea that China and the BRI could be an opportunity, but what if we get stuck with some sort of negative fallout that we didn't even think of? And so I would answer this way. The BRI, like China itself, is something that is not subjected to conceptual discussion as much as I wish it was. I've tried in the time we've had together to have a conceptual discussion about what China is. I wish that around the world people would do this with Belt and Road as well. So if we were to ask a group of policy officials from any country what they think Belt and Road is, they would say something like, oh, it's a signature foreign policy of Chinese President Xi Jinping centered on people-to-people connections and the free flow of commerce and culture around the world. And that is realized mostly through the creation of new transport infrastructure. That is what BRI is, but it's other things too. There's the argument out there that BRI is a brand, right? It's a brand. And when a project, any project, goes well, it's called BRI. When it goes badly, it's never mentioned again. That's a possibility. In answer to the question that was raised during the chat, my view of Belt and Road is that it is the two things we just mentioned, but it's also a third thing. It is the outward-facing dimension of China's own domestic development problems, right? It's very common in New Zealand, in many countries, to hear people talk as if that wasn't true, as if it was for the world. People will say things like, this sounds great. How can we get on board with Belt and Road? What can we do? The reality of it is it's not for the world at all. It's for China. If other people happen to benefit from it, then that's good. That only helps China. But the reality of global politics over the last 5,000 years is not a story of altruism or charity or even good intentions. There may indeed be some collateral damage as a result of signing up to these things. It's just that it wasn't for the world, it was for China. Everybody's looking out for their own. Is that a threat? Maybe. But that is a threat that a person can wade into and mitigate and think about, and it gets easier to manage the more you know about China, the more you know about what its domestic development challenges are, why it does the things it does. It's not out there trying to help Vietnam. It's not out there trying to help Cambodia, and it's not out there trying to help New Zealand. It's trying to help China. If other people benefit, fine. But it pays to think really about why China works the way it does, because it's often not what you think it is. That was my message for everybody this afternoon. I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness very much. Suzanne, Gay, thank you for having me. Is there anything you'd like me to do by way of wrapping up?
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to say, yeah, Namihi Nui, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve, and I'm sure, I hope I'm not being too presumptuous, but if any of the scholars wanted to ask anything, they would be free to email you.
You know where I am. Yeah, please. Gay, you've got the PowerPoint, so if people want to have the slides, that's fine.
Yep. It's up on Canvas, they can download it.
Cool. Okay. If folks want to email me, I'm happy to chat. That'd be great.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Steve, and thanks, Gay. I'll just close with a karakia. Kia mutu amato mahi, mo tēnā wā, mana kitia mai mato katoa, o mato hoa, o mato whānau, aio ki te aiorangi. So have a great rest of your day, and we're back tomorrow talking about inclusive and Indigenous trade and digital trade. So yeah, we'll see you back for that. Thank you again to all of you for your attention and your contribution.
Thanks, Steve, Gay, and Susan for today's class. And goodbye, everyone. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
Jackie,
you. See you
Thank you, Steve,
tomorrow.
Suzanne,
Thank you,
Gail,
Steve and
everyone.
Suzanne.
Thank
See you
you.
tomorrow
Thank
morning.
you.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Right. Okay. See
All
ya.
right. Sweet. Thank you.